Recently, while helping out a friend, I was able to obtain a decent amount of used carpet. The interesting thing about used carpet, checking edge retention on knives, is that it blunts knives so fast that I can compare more knives, more edge finishes, more edge angles in the same amount of time than if I was to look at how the knives performed on ropes or cardboard. And it's a huge difference. It's like comparing minutes of work to hours. The first question though that you would ask is, yeah, but are you necessarily measuring the same thing? Can you conclude that because one knife did better on carpet, it would do better on cardboard or ropes? Not necessarily. But for the knives that I'm talking about here, the performance is identical and it matches up very well because I've also used the same knives on slicing ropes and slicing cardboard, and they have the exact same rankings, which I would expect because of the way I was cutting the carpet and the ropes and the cardboard was very similar, and how they blunt is very similar. So essentially the method that I use is documented in the descriptions and the threads I'm given below. Have any questions on it? No issues, you can just ask. But basically I took a range of knives from very basic, this is literally $1 chef's knife, very soft, very low carbide steel, all the way up to something like this, which is a 121 Rex Mule from Farrad-Meer, which is 70 Rockwell, has an insane carbide volume. And it's literally considered a transition material between steels and solid carbide or ceramic. The first interesting result is that the performance peaked maybe not where you would expect. And the overall best edge retention came from the S30V blade. Now, I had seen that before. On the very soft, very low carbide blades, you get very rapid blunting. They just wear very fast and they deform very easily, which you would expect. But as you pass a certain point and keep increasing the carbide volume, the performance suffers, it dips down. And you can end up, if you go to the extreme, where a blade like this can have performance almost approaching the other end of the spectrum. Now, this is where the second interesting observation came in. For a long time, I assumed that this was critically related to the edge angle. So I had been sharpening these with a 15 degree per side edge bevel, fined DMT stone. So after I did all the initial work, I said, well, okay, I'm going to take just the 121 Rex blade, just the S30V blade, and I'm going to increase the angle to 25 degrees per side. And I increased the finish to 6 micron DMT. And I figured, well, that would stop the instability at the apex due to what I thought was carbide chip out. But it didn't. The S30V blade still had increased performance. So then I said, okay, forget this. I went up to 45 degrees per side. That's a 90 degree torner. 6 micron DMT. And the 121 Rex blade still didn't match the performance of the S30V blade. Now, interestingly enough, 90 degree edges have some interesting properties. If you've never used them, you should actually try. 90 degree edge, which is well sharpened, will do a lot of curious things, like it'll easily take the hair off your arm. It looks sharp, but it has almost no cutting ability. It's a 90 degree corner. Your edge retention gets very, very low when you climb to those really high angles overall. So I have some ideas about why this is happening. And the main thing you can understand very simply if you just look at this illustration. Now, pretend that my fingertips are essentially the apex of a knife edge. You can see it doesn't really matter what angle I make the edge. My fingertips are essentially the same thickness, more or less. And in fact, if you look at actual studies where people have measured the thickness of the actual apex, it's not strongly dependent on the sharpening angle. A sharpened apex will typically be around 0.3 to 0.5 microns. Depends a little bit on the steel and the grits and a number of other things, but a very sharp blade will be somewhere around there, and it's not sensitive to the edge angle at all. Now, if that's the case, and it is, well then think about, you have a steel like this. When you get up to the steels like 10V, k390, they have huge chunks of carbide in them, which can be 10 to 20 microns in size. Even though the individual carbides are very small, these are CPM steels, powdered metallurgy steels, there's so many of them, they just get together in big groups, and the groups are huge, 10 to 20 microns. Okay, go back to thinking about this for a second. Well, if the knife apex is the size of my fingertips, a carbide which is 10 to 20 microns is like the size of my fist. Okay, so there's the apex, my fingertips. That's the big 10 to 20 micron carbide. How can this big thing help that little tiny apex stay sharp? 10 to 20 micron carbide, that's the width of the apex. And again, doesn't matter what angle it is, you're still going to get the same width of the apex, which is my fingertips. So I have a few experiments I'm going to try out just to check this, but I think it's an interesting result that when I increase the edge angle at 25 degrees per side and even 45 degrees per side, the 121 Rex blade didn't outperform the S30V blade. The second to last point that I want to make is that a while ago, Collie Harris noted that, yeah, okay, so you have some blades like S30V, LMAX, M2 and M4 that give very high performance, slicing carpet, cardboard, ropes, and they're much higher than simple steels like this, but they also take much more effort to sharpen. What happens if you look at the kind of edge retention you get as a function of how much work you actually had to do to sharpen? And I produced another graph which basically scaled the edge retention as a function of how much work it took to sharpen the blades. And in that case, the ranking of the steels changed completely differently. And the steels that were very easy to grind all of a sudden performed very well. And this blade in particular performed dramatically well. And the reason for this is, not only is it very easy to grind, but the geometry was different, which shows, and I intentionally picked this blade for that purpose. So all of the other blades were like this. See, they have continuous bevels. There's no secondary edge bevel on this. So they all go down with very light convex grinds. They end up at around 6.5 degrees per side at the edge, and then I put micro bevels on them. So when I sharpened these blades, I had to sharpen this full big width of the blade. When I sharpened this blade, I only had to sharpen this little tiny bit of edge bevel and this little shoulder because there's a hollow grind in between them, and this sharpened much faster. So this had both effects. So it showed not only the critical effect of the geometry itself, but also of the ease of grinding of the steel. Now, the other point that I want to make is that the first comparisons I was doing when I was doing all the blades, I was looking at this carpet. I ran out of this carpet and I had to switch. So when I was comparing just the S30V paramilitary and the 121 Rex Mule, I switched to this type of carpet. If I had asked you, what do you think the relative rates of blunting of these carpets were, what would you say? So for example, if I said you were able to cut so much material on this with the paramilitary, what percentage would you cut with this? Would you think they're the same? Are they different? Which one is higher? This carpet dulled both the S30V blade and the 121 Rex blade 10 times faster than this. Consistently. I did multiple runs with this and multiple runs with this, and it was consistent. This took the blades down 10 times faster. Is that obvious from looking at them? I thought it would dull them a little bit faster because I figured more dirt would be trapped in this. I didn't expect it to be 10 times. The reason I want to make that point is that oftentimes people do comparisons and they make conclusions that are really not justified. Like if you cut a pile of this carpet with one knife and a pile of this carpet with another knife, the second knife would perform horribly compared to the first one, but it's just a difference in the carpet. And a lot of times you'll see people say that on the forums, like they'll come and say, oh yeah, I had a blade from such and such a guy, I tried to use it at work, went dull the first day, I can use the other knife for weeks. That could just be the difference in material, has nothing to do with the knife. And I have found on carpet, the results are very dramatic. And most people sort of expect that or understand it. But even on cardboard, I had found differences of up to 10 to 1. Even on hemp rope, just by a big old pile of hemp rope, I've easily found differences of 2 to 1. So the material you're cutting can have a drastic range in behavior. And if you don't sort of try to take that into account with some statistics, you'll often end up reaching conclusions which show nothing more than the difference in the material that was cut and not have anything to do with the steels or the heat treatment or anything at all like that. And there's lots of discussion about the statistics that I used in the cutting down in the description and the threads that are linked to it. So anyway, a few interesting results came up, but it was essentially a pile of garbage, and spawned some future experiments that I want to look at to answer some interesting questions, such as I was doing mainly slicing comparisons. What happens if I do push cutting comparisons? What happens if I use lower angles? What happens if I use even more coarse finishes? It's not at all trivial to say that the results would be expected to be the same in terms of which blade outperforms the other ones. All interesting questions, and I look forward to seeing what kind of answers I can produce.